Everyone thinks Russia is advancing. They're wrong. For months, the maps seem to show the same story. Russian forces inching forward village by village, trench by trench, tree line by tree line across eastern Ukraine. Military bloggers celebrated each capture like a trophy pinned to a board. State television in Moscow repeated the same phrase over and over, steady progress. But something strange has started happening beneath those headlines. Quietly, methodically, almost invisibly. Hundreds of square kilometers that Russia once controlled are now slipping away. Not in one dramatic breakthrough, not in a cinematic armored charge, but piece by piece, sector by sector, line by line, like stitches being pulled from a wound. Because the truth of this war is not written in triumphant press releases or patriotic speeches. It is written in satellite images, casualty reports, and the silent math of attrition. And the math is turning. Over the past year, Russia committed massive manpower and artillery to grind forward in places like Donetsk and Zaporizhia. Entire brigades were thrown into fortified Ukrainian defenses. Towns like Bakhmut and Avdiivka became symbols of victory in Moscow's narrative. But symbols are not strategy, and strategy has a cost. According to multiple battlefield assessments, including analyses from the Institute for the Study of War and the Royal United Services Institute, the land Russia captured during its slow advances has been progressively eroded by Ukrainian precision strikes, drone warfare, and logistical disruption. Supply lines are stretched. Ammo depots are burning. Forward positions are hollowing out. What once looked like territorial momentum now looks more like strategic exhaustion. And here is the part most people miss. The front lines of this war are not static borders. They are living systems, supply routes, artillery ranges, drone corridors, fuel pipelines. When one of those systems collapses, entire sections of territory can suddenly become impossible to hold, which is exactly what is beginning to happen. Russia didn't just lose villages. It is losing control density, the ability to physically dominate the land it claims. A battlefield victory that evaporates the moment logistics fail. This channel exists to track these deeper patterns, the strategy behind the headlines, the numbers behind the narratives, and the geopolitical forces shaping wars in real time. So if you want analysis that cuts through propaganda from both sides and shows you what the data actually says, consider subscribing. Because the story unfolding right now is bigger than a few shifting front lines. It is about the slow unraveling of a military gamble. And by the end of this video, you will understand why Russia's early battlefield gains are now turning into hundreds of square kilometers of strategic loss. Let's go back to February 24th, 2022. Before the trench lines, before the drone swarms, before the artillery duels that now define the battlefield. In the early hours of that morning, Vladimir Putin launched what the Kremlin called a special military operation. The official justification was the protection of Russian speakers and the demilitarization of Ukraine. But historians, intelligence agencies, and even former Russian insiders describe something much older beneath the rhetoric: an imperial reflex. Because for centuries, Ukraine has existed inside Russia's strategic imagination not as an independent state, but as a lost province of empire. Catherine the Great expanded Russian rule deep into the Black Sea region in the 18th century. Soviet leaders later reinforced that integration through centralized industry, military bases, and cultural control. Ukraine wasn't just a neighbor. It was infrastructure. Ports, grain, steel, pipelines, a geographic shield between Moscow and Europe. And when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, that shield disappeared overnight. 30 million people woke up in a new country. NATO began creeping east. The Kremlin's buffer zone shrank. From Moscow's perspective, history had been reversed. First NATO expansion, then the Orange Revolution in 2004, then the Euromaidan Revolution in 2014. 3 moments, 3 shocks. Not gradual changes, but political earthquakes that pulled Ukraine further into the Western orbit. The response came quickly. In 2014, Russia seized Crimea, annexing the peninsula after a rapid military operation. At the same time, Russian-backed separatists ignited a conflict in eastern Ukraine's Donbass region. For 8 years, that war simmered. Low intensity, high stakes. Then came 2022, when the Kremlin made the calculation that Ukraine could be taken quickly before the West fully reacted. Russian columns surged toward Kiev, armored vehicles rolled across multiple fronts, and intelligence officials predicted the government might collapse within days. But the plan rested on three assumptions. First, Ukrainian resistance would crumble. Second, Western unity would fracture. Third, Russia's military modernization had created an unstoppable force. All three assumptions proved wrong. Instead of a lightning victory, Russia found itself trapped in the oldest form of warfare humanity knows: industrial attrition. Shells, trenches, blood, distance. A war where progress is measured not in speeches, but in meters. And that is how Russia began its slow grinding push across eastern Ukraine, capturing ground, yes, but paying for every kilometer in ammunition, soldiers, and time. Which brings us to the brutal arithmetic now emerging. Because those early gains came at a cost that is finally coming due. This is why what is happening now was always coming. 700,000. That is the estimated number of Russian soldiers killed or wounded since the invasion began, according to assessments cited by the Center for Strategic and International Studies and Western intelligence briefings reported by NATO officials. 700,000. That number is not just a statistic. It is a generation of young men pulled from factory towns, mining cities, and rural villages across Russia, sons who boarded buses believing they would return in weeks, not vanish into the mud of eastern Ukraine. Families waiting, phones silent, doors never opening again. And for what? For a few kilometers of scarred farmland, for a ruined industrial district, for trenches that change hands so often they barely exist on the map. Now zoom out. Throughout 2023 and early 2024, Russian forces launched relentless assaults in eastern Ukraine, particularly around Avdiivka and Bakhmut. Satellite analysis from the Institute for the Study of War showed Russian units advancing slowly, but consistently, meters per day, sometimes less. But those advances came with a devastating ratio. According to battlefield estimates cited by analysts at the Royal United Services Institute, Russian units in certain sectors were losing hundreds of soldiers per square kilometer gained. Hundreds. That means entire battalions sacrificed for territory smaller than a city park. And behind those numbers are people like Alexei, a 34-year-old Ukrainian drone operator interviewed by regional reporters near the front. Every morning, he launches small reconnaissance drones over Russian trench lines. What he sees, he says, is the same pattern repeating again and again. Columns forming, infantry advancing, artillery opening, then the drones strike. Sometimes they keep coming even after the first explosions, he told reporters. They know the drones are there, but the orders are to keep moving. Forward, always forward. The war has become a grinding machine where men are fed into artillery corridors measured by satellite, mapped by algorithms, and hunted by drones the size of dinner plates. And here is the strategic consequence. When you burn through manpower and equipment at that scale, territorial control becomes fragile. Units rotate slower. Supply lines thin. Defensive positions weaken. What looked like steady Russian expansion begins to resemble something else entirely. A front line stretched too thin to survive. Because territory isn't controlled by flags on maps. It's controlled by soldiers who can hold the line tomorrow. And that's the number Russia is running out of. The bill arrives. If you follow our channel, you know we don't just repeat headlines. We break down the strategy, the numbers, and the geopolitical mechanics shaping wars in real time. So if you want analysis with real strategic depth, not propaganda from either side, consider subscribing. Because the next part of this story changes everything. Let's keep going. But here's the part nobody talks about. The real battlefield of this war isn't just the trenches outside Donetsk or the shell-scarred suburbs of Avdiivka. It's the logistics network behind them. Because territory in modern war is not held by courage alone. It is held by supply density, fuel, ammunition, drones, artillery shells, replacement troops, repair depots, satellite intelligence. Break that system, and the land above it collapses like a hollow structure. And over the past year, Ukraine has been quietly targeting exactly that system. Precision strikes using Western supplied weapons have repeatedly hit Russian ammunition depots, command centers, and logistics hubs across occupied territory. According to battlefield analyses cited by the Institute for the Study of War, Ukrainian long range strikes have forced Russian supply nodes to move farther from the front line. Farther distance means slower resupply. Slower resupply means thinner defenses. Thinner defenses mean lost ground. It's a chain reaction. And here's the hidden truth. The map Russia shows the world, the shaded territories, the claimed districts, the captured towns, often hides a more fragile reality underneath. In many sectors, Russian units are not fully occupying the land they claim. They're holding narrow corridors of trenches connected by overstretched supply routes, like veins running through a body that is slowly losing blood. A battlefield map might show control over hundreds of square kilometers. But if those kilometers depend on a handful of vulnerable roads and depots, control becomes an illusion. And the economic side of this war deepens the problem. Russia is spending enormous sums sustaining this front. Military expenditures have surged to historic levels, forcing the Kremlin to redirect resources away from civilian infrastructure and domestic investment. The opportunity cost is staggering. The billions of dollars poured into artillery shells, armored vehicles, and missile production could have rebuilt aging hospitals across Siberia, modernized rail networks, or stabilized rural economies struggling with depopulation. Instead, those resources are being burned in fields and industrial ruins across eastern Ukraine. And the deeper analysts dig into this logistical picture, the clearer the pattern becomes. Even independent military researchers, including analysts publishing through regional security platforms like War on the Rocks, have noted that Russia's territorial gains increasingly resemble temporary battlefield pressure rather than durable strategic control, which means something profound is happening. Russia is not just fighting Ukraine, it is fighting the physics of modern warfare, and physics eventually wins. Now, Vladimir Putin's reaction to all of this has been revealing. Not cautious, not restrained, but doubled down. As Russian casualty numbers climbed and battlefield momentum slowed, the Kremlin did not pause the war machine. It accelerated it. In September 2022, Moscow announced what it called a partial mobilization. The word partial sounded technical, clinical, but across Russia, the reality looked very different. Men were pulled from factories in Siberia, construction sites in Moscow, and remote villages stretching across the Ural Mountains. Videos flooded social media, buses arriving in the night, families crying at train stations, recruits handed rifles that looked older than they were. Hundreds of thousands called up, some trained for weeks, some for days, then sent to the front. Because the Kremlin's strategy was simple: if territory requires manpower, then the solution is more manpower. Throw weight at the line, reinforce the trenches, push again. But mass mobilization comes with its own consequences. When a government suddenly drafts large portions of its working age population, the economy feels it immediately. Factories lose workers. Small businesses lose owners. Skilled labor disappears into uniform. And the message sent to the public is unmistakable. This war isn't temporary. It's generational. At the same time, the Kremlin moved to silence dissent. New laws criminalized criticism of the military. Independent journalists faced arrest. Opposition figures were marginalized, exiled, or imprisoned. The state narrative hardened. Victory is inevitable. Sacrifice is necessary. Questioning the war is betrayal. But here's the paradox of authoritarian control. When you suppress a society's ability to debate a war, you also suppress its ability to correct mistakes inside that war. Bad strategies continue longer. Broken logistics persist. Commanders repeat failures because no one is allowed to say they are failures. And the result is visible across the battlefield. The mobilization solved one problem, manpower, but it created another: inexperienced units. uneven training, fragile cohesion. Entire formations holding territory they barely understand, supplied through routes already under pressure, defending land captured at enormous cost. The crackdown on criticism didn't stabilize the war effort. It baptized the opposition. Because every arrest, every censorship order, every forced mobilization quietly told Russian society the same thing. This war is far more fragile than the Kremlin admits. That's not strategy. That's desperation. Here is what the numbers are really telling us. For months, analysts have argued over maps: which side gained a village, which side lost a ridgeline, which side pushed a few hundred meters across a field outside Donetsk. The debate sounds technical, clinical, but the real story isn't in the map colors. It's in the rate of consumption behind those colors. Because modern industrial warfare is not primarily about land. It is about how fast each side can burn through the resources required to hold that land: artillery shells, armored vehicles, trained soldiers, logistics capacity, and time. Russia chose a strategy built on pressure. Grind forward slowly. Accept heavy casualties. Capture territory piece by piece until Ukraine's defenses collapse. But that strategy contains a hidden trap. Every kilometer gained increases the amount of territory that must be defended tomorrow. Every trench captured becomes another trench that needs soldiers, ammunition, and supply routes. Expansion increases the burn rate. And that is exactly what we are seeing now. Analysts at the Royal United Services Institute have repeatedly warned that Russia's battlefield approach resembles a resource-intensive attritional model, one that demands constant manpower replacement and enormous artillery consumption to maintain even minimal territorial pressure. In other words, the advance feeds the exhaustion. Military historian Lawrence Freedman put it bluntly in one assessment of the war's trajectory. The critical question is not who holds a village today, but who can sustain the cost of holding it tomorrow. And that is the moment the entire story becomes clear. Because what looked like Russian battlefield momentum may actually be something very different. Not expansion, consumption, not strategic progress, strategic depletion. This wasn't a Russian advance. It was a Russian burn rate. Once you see the war through that lens, everything changes. The brutal casualty numbers make sense. The desperate mobilizations make sense. The fragile supply networks make sense. Russia wasn't just trying to capture territory. It was spending itself to do it. And history has seen this pattern before: empires pushing outward faster than their resources can sustain, mistaking short-term momentum for long-term strength. At first, the maps grow. Then the costs grow faster. And eventually, the arithmetic catches up. When it does, the land gained at enormous sacrifice becomes impossible to hold, and the battlefield begins to reverse. And what does this mean for you? Whether you're watching from Europe, North America, or Asia, the slow unraveling of Russian battlefield gains has ripple effects far beyond eastern Ukraine. First, energy prices and supply chains. Russia controls critical pipelines and shipping routes for natural gas and oil. When its control over territory becomes unstable, every swing in supply hits global markets. Heating bills spike. Gasoline prices fluctuate. Factories hesitate to plan production. The cost is real and immediate. Second, financial markets and economic stability. Investors do not only bet on companies, they bet on stability. Russian debt, Ukrainian reconstruction funds, and European energy hedges all depend on predictability. Each report of Russian territorial loss adds risk premiums, sends stock indexes tumbling, and forces central banks to adjust rates. Your retirement fund, pension plan, and savings account feel it first, even if indirectly. Third, military and strategic balance of power. Ukraine's ability to regain territory signals that long-range precision strikes, drone warfare, and Western intelligence sharing are game changers. Countries watching from China to India are recalculating force multipliers. NATO planners and regional defense strategists are reassessing deployment and deterrence strategies across Europe. Fourth, global resource control. Eastern Ukraine is not just farmland. It's heavy industry, ports, and mineral deposits. Who controls the land controls the output, and thus global supply chains for everything from steel to grain. When Russia loses sections of territory, international markets anticipate bottlenecks or shifts in export routes. And the domino logic is clear. If Russian control weakens, energy markets jitter. If energy markets jitter, inflation rises globally. If inflation rises, economies contract and political unrest grows. Every ripple connects back to you. Foreign policy experts, including Ian Bremmer, have emphasized that understanding these local territorial shifts is not an academic exercise. It is a direct measure of global stability. This is not just a story about Russia and Ukraine. This is a story about how the fragile architecture of modern geopolitics, economics, and security can hinge on hundreds of square kilometers in Eastern Europe. Your heating bill, your job security, your nation's strategic posture. All of it links back to this battlefield. Understanding it is not optional. It is an act of civic intelligence. There are two paths from here. Path 1, the optimistic but difficult scenario. Ukraine continues to leverage precision strikes, drone attacks, and Western intelligence support. Russian supply lines collapse under continuous attrition, forcing Moscow into a strategic withdrawal across multiple fronts. The front lines stabilize in Ukraine's favor, and over the next year, Kyiv recaptures key industrial hubs, forcing Russia to rethink its war strategy entirely. In this scenario, the international community sees a war of recovery and rebuilding. Ukraine regains sovereignty over its occupied territories. Western aid continues to flow, and the Kremlin faces growing internal dissent at home. Path 2, the darker, more likely scenario. Russia adapts, shifts tactics, and fortifies core positions with heavier artillery and deeper trenches. Moscow doubles down on mobilization, sending inexperienced units to the front. Ukraine's advances slow as attrition battles become protracted stalemates. Winter and logistical constraints compound the fighting. Progress is measured in meters, not kilometers, as both sides bleed resources. International observers note that temporary Ukrainian gains become reversible, with Moscow holding onto strategic choke points. The war continues as a long-term drain on both nations, destabilizing energy markets, inflating global prices, and keeping the world on edge. I think Path 2 is more likely than most analysts want to admit. And here is why. Russia still possesses the artillery, manpower reserves, and unconventional methods to maintain pressure, even if at a heavy cost. Meanwhile, Ukraine, despite its innovations, faces resource constraints and the limits of sustaining a counteroffensive across multiple sectors simultaneously. The key question becomes, will Moscow stabilize its lines faster than Kyiv can exploit vulnerabilities, or will attrition and supply chain failures force a genuine Russian retreat? Everything hinges on this calculus. What do you think? Will Ukraine continue to push back Russia successfully, or will Moscow consolidate and hold its ground? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. Let's return to the opening image. Hundreds of square kilometers once under Russian control, now quietly slipping away. The maps show boundaries, but they cannot capture the human cost, the fragile supply lines, or the arithmetic of attrition that is reshaping the battlefield. The history books will not be kind to this campaign. They will record that early gains, celebrated with fanfare, were ultimately purchased at unsustainable rates, lives lost, equipment exhausted, and morale drained. Long after the generals and politicians are gone, the consequences of these decisions will remain etched into the land, the economy, and global strategic balance. This is the real legacy, not propaganda victories, not temporary banners on captured towns. The legacy is consumption disguised as conquest, attrition masquerading as advancement, and fragile control being mistaken for true strength. Still, soldiers fall. Still, supply lines burn. Still, territory changes hands faster than it can be solidly held. If you want to track this war as it unfolds, with maps, data, and analysis that the mainstream won't show you, subscribe to our channel. Follow the strategy behind the headlines. If you want others to understand what's really happening on the front lines and in global markets, share this video. Give them a perspective they cannot get anywhere else. And if you have a view on the two paths ahead, tell us in the comments. We read every single one, and your insight becomes part of the conversation. Thanks for watching our channel. We'll see you tomorrow.